The water glass shattered before it hit the floor. My mother-in-law's hand was still hanging in the air where she'd been gesturing, and her face, that perfectly composed face she always wore around me, had gone the color of old paper. Across the table, my father-in-law's jaw was working, but no sound came out. My wife had her hand pressed flat against her chest, like she was trying to keep her heart inside her ribcage. Ha! Que fue lo que dijiste? My mother-in-law finally managed, the words barely above a whisper. I picked up my napkin, dabbed the corner of my mouth, and set it back down beside my plate. I took my time. After everything I'd just sat through, I figured I'd earned the right to take my time, but I'm jumping ahead. Let me back up about 7 hours, because the moment doesn't make sense without the dinner that came before it, and the dinner doesn't make sense without the 3 years that came before that. My name's Hollis Brennan. I'm 43 years old. I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm in Charlotte, North Carolina, and until that Saturday evening in late September, I genuinely believed I had built myself a good life. A wife I loved, a son I adored, a house with a porch where I drink coffee in the mornings and watch the dogwoods bloom in the spring. The kind of life that wasn't flashy but felt earned. My wife's name is Catalina Vega. We met 5 years ago at a charity 5K downtown. She was handing out water cups at mile 2, and I made some dumb joke about needing IV fluids, and she laughed in a way that made me forget my legs were on fire. 2 years later, we got married at a small chapel out in the foothills. 18 months after that, our son Mateo was born. 8 pounds, 2 ounces, with a head full of dark hair and a cry that could rattle windows. Catalina's family came over from Venezuela when she was 9. Her parents, Esteban and Marisol, ran a chain of 3 Latin grocery stores out in the suburbs of Charlotte. Did well. Very well, actually. The kind of well where they bought a house in Myers Park with a pool and a guest casita and a circular drive. They'd always treated me with a kind of careful, distant politeness. Like I was a house guest who'd overstayed, but they were too well-mannered to say anything. I'd chalked it up to the protective parent thing. The cultural distance thing. Whatever thing I needed to tell myself so I could keep showing up to their Sunday lunches. What none of them knew, what Catalina didn't know, was that I'd spent 5 years of my early 20s living in Bogotá, Colombia. My first job out of grad school was with a civil engineering firm doing infrastructure work for a public transit expansion. From 2008 to 2013, I lived in a 4th-floor walk-up in La Candelaria, drank tinto every morning at the cafe on the corner, and worked alongside Colombian engineers who refused to slow down their Spanish for the gringo. I left that city fluent. Not tourist fluent. Not even business meeting fluent. I left it able to argue with a contractor in Spanish at 6 in the morning over reinforcement specs. Able to read a sun-bleached newspaper without picking up a dictionary. Able to understand the kind of slang and double meanings that don't show up in any textbook. Why did I never mention it? That's the part everybody asks. The truth is boring. When I came back to the States in 2013, my mother was dying of pancreatic cancer. I spent the next 2 years sitting in her hospital room watching her shrink. By the time I met Catalina at that 5K, I hadn't spoken Spanish in nearly 4 years, and Bogotá felt like something that had happened to a different version of me. Then there was the firm I'd worked for in Colombia. They'd had me sign a long non-disclosure agreement when I left because we'd been bidding on a sensitive government contract that ultimately got tangled up in a corruption investigation. Lawyers had told me more than once not to talk publicly about my work there. So when Catalina mentioned her family was from Venezuela and asked if I'd ever traveled in Latin America, I just said no. Not a real lie. Just a small one. Just the kind of small lie you tell to keep your life simple. I never imagined that small lie was going to save me. The invitation came on a Tuesday. Catalina was in the kitchen chopping cilantro and didn't turn around when she said it. Mama wants us over Saturday. She's doing a big dinner. Some family from Miami flying in. Mateo, too? He'll be there, yeah. He spends the night with them every other Saturday anyway, you know that. I did know that. Mateo's abuela weekends had been a fixture of our routine since he was 8 months old. Catalina said the grandparents loved having him, and I always thought it was sweet. A little break for us, a little spoiling for him. Who's flying in? I asked. She finally turned around, wiped her hands on a dish towel, smiled at me. My cousin Diego and his wife, and one of my dad's old business partners. They're celebrating something. Celebrating something. I should have asked what? I should have asked a lot of things over those 5 years. Instead, I just said okay and went back to looking at the spec sheets on my laptop. Saturday came. I shaved, put on a button-down and the navy blazer Catalina had picked out for our anniversary, and we drove the 20 minutes to Myers Park. Mateo had been there since the night before. When Esteban opened the door, he did his usual handshake, firm, just a second too long, eyes scanning me like a man inspecting a piece of used furniture for cracks. Marisol kissed Catalina on both cheeks and gave me a smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. The dining room was set for 10, crystal, linen. The silver Marisol only brought out for what she called occasions of consequence. Diego turned out to be a thick-necked man in his 50s, with a politician's smile, and his wife Yolanda was a woman with so much jewelry on her hands that she clicked when she gestured. The old business partner was a man named Rafael Mendoza, gray-haired, sharp-eyed, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my truck. He shook my hand and said, in carefully accented English, that he was pleased to meet me. Mateo came running out of the den in his little dinosaur pajamas, threw himself at my legs, and yelled "Papa!" loud enough that everyone laughed. I picked him up, kissed the top of his head, breathed in that little boy's smell of strawberry shampoo and graham crackers, and felt, for the last time, although I didn't know it then, like a man who had everything he'd ever wanted. Marisol took him from my arms a few minutes later and carried him off to put him to bed in the guest room upstairs. The rest of us sat down to eat. The first half hour was normal, or what passed for normal in that house. Esteban poured wine, Marisol brought out the food and courses, and the conversation moved between English and Spanish in the way it always did. Spanish when they were talking among themselves. English when they remembered I was there. I'd long since stopped flinching when they switched. I'd learned to smile, nod, eat my food, and look like the polite southern son-in-law who didn't speak the language. The first thing that caught my ear came around the second glass of wine. "Mira que tonto se ve con esa chaqueta," Yolanda murmured to Marisol, looking at me over the rim of her glass. "Look how stupid he looks in that jacket." Marisol laughed lightly. "Pobrecito. Hace lo que puede." Poor thing. He does what he can. I felt my face want to flush, and I shoved it back down. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. Smiled at Yolanda when she looked over. Smiled like I hadn't understood a single thing. I figured it was just casual cruelty. Rich people cruelty. I put up with worse at company holiday parties. I told myself to let it go. Then Esteban set his fork down, leaned toward Rafael, and said something that made me forget the jacket entirely. "Diego ya tiene los papeles para la transferencia. Cuando salga el divorcio, la casa pasa directo al fideicomiso familiar." Catalina firma. "Y el gringo no se entera de nada hasta que es demasiado tarde." Diego already has the papers ready for the transfer. When the divorce comes through, the house goes directly into the family trust. Catalina signs, and the gringo finds out nothing until it's too late. The room didn't tilt. It didn't go silent the way they do in movies. The chandelier kept burning. The silverware kept clinking. Somebody laughed at something at the other end of the table. But inside my chest, something cold and clean opened up, like a window someone had finally pried loose after years of being painted shut. I reached for the breadbasket. I tore a piece of bread in half. I chewed. Rafael nodded slowly. "Y el niño?" "And the boy?" Marisol answered, returning from upstairs and easing herself back into her chair. "Y el niño se queda con nosotros, claro. Catalina lo lleva los fines de semana cuando quiera. Pero el niño es nuestro. Siempre lo ha sido. Diego lo cría como hijo propio." The boy stays with us, of course. Catalina takes him on weekends when she wants, but the boy is ours. He always has been. Diego will raise him as his own son. Diego. Diego, who was sitting 4 seats down from me. Diego, who I just met an hour ago. I picked up my wine glass. My hand was perfectly steady. I'd been a structural engineer for 20 years. I knew how to make my hands behave when the rest of me wanted to come apart. I turned and looked across the table at my wife. Catalina was cutting her chicken with the precise little motions she always used when she didn't want to make eye contact. She'd been quiet most of the dinner, I realized. Quieter than I'd registered. She wasn't looking at me. She wasn't looking at Diego either. She was just cutting her chicken into smaller and smaller squares. Es una pena que sea tan ingenuo, Marisol continued almost fondly, in the tone of someone discussing a slow dog they were rather attached to. It's a pity he's so naive. Pero gracias a su ingenuidad tenemos a Mateo aquí, en este país, con papeles, con seguro médico, con todo. Catalina hizo bien. But thanks to his naivety we have Mateo here, in this country, with papers, with health insurance, with everything. Catalina did well. I set the wine glass down. I did the math in my head, the way I do load calculations on a structure. Mateo was 21 months old. Catalina and I had been married 3 years and 4 months. Mateo had been born 13 months into our marriage. Catalina had gotten pregnant by my count, around month 4, which would have been right after our wedding, right after she'd come back from a family trip to visit relatives in Miami. A trip Diego, I was now realizing, had also been on. I lifted my eyes and looked directly at Diego for the first time. He was watching me. Not hard, not threateningly, just the casual, faintly amused way you watch a man you've decided is less than you. He had dark hair and a strong jaw and eyes that, now that I was looking, were the same shape as Mateo's eyes. Eyes, I'd always told myself, Mateo got from Catalina's side of the family. He had, just not from Catalina's side of the family. He had, just not from Catalina. El parecido es increíble, Yolanda was murmuring to Marisol. The resemblance is incredible. Cada mes se parece más a su padre. Every month he looks more like his father. Gracias a Dios el gringo es daltónico para la sangre, Marisol said, and they both laughed quietly. Thank God the gringo is colorblind to blood. I asked the waiter, they always had a hired server for these dinners, for more wine. I asked in English. He filled my glass. I thanked him in English. I did everything in English. I let them keep believing. The conversation went on like that for another 40 minutes. I learned a lot in those 40 minutes. I learned that Catalina had been with Diego since they were teenagers, and that the families had always intended them to marry. But Diego had gotten into legal trouble in Miami in his 20s, and his immigration status had become complicated. I learned that Catalina had been sent to Charlotte specifically to find a stable American husband, Esteban's words, to anchor the family's residency for the next generation. I learned that the plan had originally been to divorce me within 18 months of Mateo's birth, but my ridiculous attachment to the boy had made them wait. They wanted everything documented first. They wanted the house in the family trust. They wanted Mateo's preschool enrollment, his pediatrician records, everything paperworked into a shape where I'd look like the one walking away. I learned that there was a lawyer in Miami already drafting the divorce filing, that the grounds were going to be irreconcilable differences with allegations of emotional neglect. That they had 3 of Catalina's friends ready to sign affidavits about my controlling behavior I had no memory of because it had never happened. I learned that they had a folder, an actual folder, Marisol said with a small proud smile, of photographs of me from various angles looking irritable or withdrawn pictures Catalina had taken without my knowing over the past year. I learned that everything in our house, including a savings account I thought we held jointly, had been quietly moved into Catalina's name only, using a power of attorney I'd signed last spring for what I'd been told was a refinance application. And I learned this was the last thing, and it was the worst thing, that they had already been telling Mateo, in Spanish, when I wasn't around, that Diego was his real father. Marisol had been doing it. Para que no sea un shock cuando llegue el momento, she said. So it isn't a shock when the moment comes. A 21-month-old. They had been whispering to my son, in a language I wasn't supposed to understand, that I was not his father. I cannot describe to you what that did to me. I will not try. There isn't a word in any language I know for what opens up in a man when he hears that. Marisol turned to me then with her warm hostess smile and switched to English. Hollis, you've been so quiet, my Joe. Are you feeling well? You hardly touched your dinner. I looked at her. I looked at this woman who had held my son that afternoon, who had kissed his cheek and called him mi tesoro, who was at this very moment plotting how to take him from me and erase me from his life. I smiled. I made it a soft smile. I made it the smile of a slow, polite, colorblind to blood gringo who didn't understand anything. And then I said, in the Bogotá Spanish I'd spent 5 years learning in a fourth-floor walk-up in La Candelaria, Spanish so unmistakable in its accent that no Latin American at that table could possibly mistake it for textbook study. Estoy bien, suegra. Solo estaba pensando en lo interesante que escuchar una conversación cuando la gente cree que uno no entiende ni una palabra. I'm fine, mother-in-law. I was just thinking about how interesting it is to hear a conversation when people believe you don't understand a single word. That's when the water glass shattered. Marisol had been reaching for it. Her fingers convulsed around it. It hit the edge of her plate and broke into 3 pieces, and water ran across the linen in a wide, flat sheet and dripped off the edge of the table onto the floor. Nobody moved to clean it up. Esteban had gone completely still. Catalina had stopped cutting her chicken. Diego was the one I was watching, because Diego was the one whose face had gone from amused to alert to something close to afraid in about 2 seconds. Diego understood, faster than the older ones did, that the man he'd been laughing at for the past hour wasn't who he thought. Hablas Español, Esteban finally said. Half question, half curse. I switched back to English, because I wanted them to hear it the way Mateo would hear it someday, when he was old enough to be told. I speak Spanish, I said. I lived in Bogotá for 5 years. I worked there. I dreamed in that language for a while. I just never told any of you because I didn't think it mattered. I paused. I looked at each one of them in turn. Turns out it mattered. Yolanda made a small whimpering sound. Diego had put his hand on the table like he was bracing himself. I turned to Catalina. My wife, the woman whose name I still had to remind myself was a real name attached to a real person, and not just a sound I'd been saying for 5 years to someone I didn't actually know. Is Mateo mine? I asked, quietly, just to her. The rest of the table fell away. She didn't answer. Her eyes filled up and she pressed her napkin to her mouth. Biologically, I said, is he mine? She shook her head. Just once. Small. How long with Diego? I asked. Always. Her voice cracked. Hollis, please let me. Don't. I held up my hand. I was surprised by how level my voice still was. Don't say my name like that. Don't say it like you're the one who's hurt. I stood up. The chair scraped on the hardwood. Esteban started to rise too, and I looked at him in a way that put him right back down. I'm going to get my son, I said. I'm taking him home. Tonight. To my house, which is in my name and the deed of which I'm going to have my lawyer pull from the courthouse first thing Monday morning to confirm has not been quietly altered. He sleeps in his bed tonight. Hollis, Catalina started. He is 21 months old, I said. He calls me Papa. He fell asleep on my chest 2 nights ago watching the Panthers game. He is my son. Whatever you people think you built around that fact is not stronger than that fact. I promise you it isn't. I walked out of that dining room. I went upstairs. Mateo was asleep in the guest bed, one arm flung over a stuffed dinosaur, his little chest rising and falling. I scooped him up. He barely stirred, wrapped him in the blanket Marisol had laid over him, and carried him down the stairs. Nobody tried to stop me. Nobody said a word as I walked through the foyer. I unlocked my truck with my free hand, strapped him into his car seat, and drove home with my son still asleep in the back and my whole life burning down behind me. I didn't go to bed that night. I sat on the floor outside his room with my back against the wall and made phone calls until the sun came up. My older brother in Raleigh, who's an immigration attorney, my best friend from college, who's a divorce lawyer in Atlanta and gave me the name of the best family law shark in Charlotte, a woman named Eileen Prosser, who, he said, eats men like your father-in-law for breakfast. My boss, who answered at 6 a.m. and didn't ask a single question when I told him I needed 3 weeks of family leave starting Monday. My mom, who's been gone 12 years, who I just talked to anyway because I needed to say it out loud to somebody who would have loved my son, no matter whose DNA was in him. By Monday morning, I had Eileen Prosser sitting across from me at a conference table downtown. She was about 60, built like a fence post, and she listened to my entire story without writing a single thing down. When I finished, she said, Mr. Brennan, I'd like to be very clear with you. You are in a much stronger position than you currently understand. Let me explain why. I'm not going to walk you through every motion in every hearing. There were a lot of them. They lasted from October to the following May, and they were the most expensive and exhausting 7 months of my life. But here's what mattered. I was on Mateo's birth certificate as his father. In North Carolina, that is what's called a legal presumption of paternity. Once that presumption has stood unchallenged for more than 2 years, it becomes extremely difficult, in many cases impossible, to overturn. Even with DNA evidence, Diego could prove he was the biological father 1,000 times over, and it would not, by itself, give him a single legal right to my son. Catalina knew this. Her parents had not. The power of attorney they'd used to move our savings was discovered to have been notarized by a notary public, who was Marisol's cousin, with a signature on my behalf that a handwriting analyst was prepared to testify was a forgery. That alone opened up a fraud case that the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office took an interest in. Eileen brought in a forensic accountant who traced the movement of money out of accounts I'd been told were ours, and into a trust controlled by Esteban. The picture that emerged was not a divorce. It was a long, patient, multi-year financial fraud against me, with my marriage as the cover. Then there was the immigration piece. Catalina's residency in this country was tied in part to our marriage, a marriage entered into for the primary purpose of obtaining or maintaining immigration benefits is, under federal law, a removable offense. My brother in Raleigh quietly walked me through what that meant. I did not have to be the one to report it. The investigation flowing out of the financial fraud case and the affidavits we collected, including 2 from Catalina's own friends who, faced with the prospect of perjury charges, decided they did not in fact want to sign the affidavits about my controlling behavior, were going to do that work on their own. They did. In May, the judge, a man in his late 50s with reading glasses he kept pushing up his nose, granted me full physical and legal custody of Mateo. Catalina was given supervised visitation 12 hours a month at a court-approved facility. Diego was denied any standing to pursue paternal rights, on the grounds that he had taken no action to establish paternity during the relevant window, and that doing so now would not be in the child's best interest. The divorce was granted on grounds of fraud. The house, which they had not in fact succeeded in transferring before I caught them, remained in my name. The savings were ordered restored with interest. 6 weeks after the custody ruling, Catalina was notified that her permanent residency was being placed under review. 8 months after that, she returned voluntarily to Venezuela rather than face removal proceedings. I'm told Diego went with her. I don't know, and I don't care. Esteban and Marisol still live in Myers Park, in a smaller house now. The grocery stores took a hit when the fraud case made the local paper, and 2 of the 3 locations have since closed. I drive past their old place sometimes when I'm in that part of town. I don't slow down. Mateo is 4 now. He starts pre-K in August. He's a wild, loud, deeply silly little boy who is obsessed with construction equipment and asks me, on average, 200 questions a day about why things are the way they are. He calls me Papa. He has my last name. He does not remember Catalina, and he does not ask about her. Someday he will, and I will tell him the truth in pieces, in the shapes a child can hold. I will not tell him to hate her. I will tell him that his mother loved him in the only way she knew how, which was not enough, and that I love him in the way he deserved, which is everything. I'm going to tell you a few things, and then I'm going to go check on my son, because it's almost his bedtime and he's been suspiciously quiet for 10 minutes, which in our house means a crayon is about to ruin something. The first thing, if the small voice in the back of your head is telling you something is off in your marriage, listen to it. Don't talk yourself out of it. I had heard that voice for at least 18 months before that dinner, and every time I'd silenced it by telling myself I was being paranoid, controlling, insecure. I was none of those things. I was being lied to by people who were very good at lying. The voice was right. Your voice is probably right too. The second thing, document everything. Boring things. Financial statements, text message threads, who was at what dinner, who said what about whom. You will not believe how much of what saved me in court came down to dates I'd scribbled in a project notebook, because I scribbled dates in everything out of habit. The third thing, and this is the one I'd write on a wall if I could. Biology is not fatherhood. Biology is a contribution. Fatherhood is what you do at 3 a.m. when somebody small and scared needs you. Fatherhood is what you do over 21 months of bottles and diapers and ear infections and first steps. Fatherhood is showing up. Diego contributed a cell. I built a son. The law eventually agreed with me, but the law was just catching up to what was already true. The fourth thing. Some people are going to look at the life you've built and see a tool. They will not see you. They will see what you can be used for. That is not your fault. You are not stupid for trusting people. You are not naive for assuming the people who said they loved you actually did. The shame for that belongs to them. Keep it where it belongs. The last thing. Learn a language. I'm only half kidding. You never know when the small lie you told to keep your life simple is going to turn around 5 years later and save the one thing you can't lose. Mateo's calling me. He's standing at the top of the stairs in his shark pajamas yelling that there's a situation in his room, which is his new word, and which can mean anything from a stuffed animal that has fallen off the bed to actual structural damage. I have to go. That dinner ended one life. It ended the life I thought I was living, with people I thought I knew, in a story I thought was mine. But it began another one, a quieter one, a truer one, a life where the man at the head of the table is the man my son thinks he is, and where the only language being spoken in my kitchen is the one we both understand. I'll take it. I've thought about that dinner more times than I can count. Not the part where I spoke Spanish. That part was easy, almost reflexive, like my body remembered Bogotá before my brain did. The part I keep coming back to is the 40 minutes before. The 40 minutes I sat there with a fork in my hand and listened to people I had loved, people I had trusted with my son, decide out loud that I was nothing more than a signature on a piece of paper. What I've come to understand, sitting on my porch in the years since, is that what happened to me did not happen by accident. It was the result of a chain of small choices, theirs and mine, stretched out over years. Marisol and Esteban did not become the kind of people who could plot the theft of a child overnight. They built themselves into that, one small contempt at a time, until contempt was the only language they spoke to each other about me, and I did not become the man who could be sat at the head of that table and laughed at, without my knowing overnight either. I built that too, by silencing the small voice that had been whispering to me for 18 months. Every time I told myself I was being paranoid, I was teaching that voice to whisper quieter. Every cause has its effect. Every effect was a cause once. The dinner did not come out of nowhere. It came out of every dinner before it. I think a lot now about what it means to raise a son. Mateo is going to grow up watching me, and what he sees is going to become his definition of what a man is. So I try to be 3 things in front of him, and I try to be them on the bad days too, not just the good ones. I try to be honest, even about small things, because I learned what dishonesty costs when it scales up. I try to be thoughtful, to read, to ask questions, to admit when I don't know something. Because the people at that dinner thought they were smart and they weren't, and the difference between them and a wise person is the difference between knowing things and knowing yourself. And I try to be steady, to not break when breaking would be easier. Diego and Marisol counted on me being soft. They were not wrong that I was kind. They were wrong that kindness is the same as weakness. Those are not the same thing at all, and I want my son to know the difference long before anybody ever tries to use one against him. If there's anything I'd hand to somebody reading this, it's that the life you have was built by choices, and the life you'll have tomorrow is being built by the choices you're making right now. Pay attention to the quiet ones. The small lies, the moments you look away, the questions you don't ask, those are the bricks. You're laying them whether you know it or not. Lay them like somebody's watching, because eventually, somebody small and important always is.